not just to launch this particular book, which is by far one of the best I've read recently, and or maybe ever. It's a good book. But more specifically, to welcome Kojo back to the bookshop. 3 years?
Yeah.
3 years since he last came up for the very brilliant book on the war on drugs and the global colour line. And clearly, while the rest of us were holed up in lockdown, doing nothing, Kojo wrote a book, An Uncommon Wealth, Britain and the Aftermath of Empire. And I'll just read you his bio as well. Kojo's a writer and an academic. He teaches at the School of Law at Birkbeck College. He's born in Accra, Ghana, and raised on Merseyside. He's now based in London. He was called to the Bar of England and Wales in 2011, received his PhD in 2017, and in 2018, the Association for the Study of Law, Culture and Humanities awarded, I'm just making you cringe right now, his PhD, the prestigious Julian Measy Award.
I know my mum sent you this bio, didn't she?
Well, I mean, either that or your agent. In addition to his academic writing, he's written for The New Statesman, The Guardian, Dissent, The Nation, The Washington Post, and has appeared on CNN, Sky News, and all the other good stuff. Uncommon Wealth got the most brilliant review in Jacobin today. And I would entreat you all that if he doesn't convince you to buy the book, read the Jacobin review, because it's, very complimentary. Since we are all in a room and we don't have to do that awkward thing of not clapping at home, I'm going to ask you all to join me in putting your hands together to welcome Kojo Koram.
Oh, thank you for that. That definitely is my mum's bio. Like, that's what she tells, all the aunties at church about me anytime she meets them. But thank you so much for sharing that.
Strangers and testers.
This is the price he wants. This is it. And it's wonderful to be back here in Edinburgh, back in this bookshop, which definitely is one of my favourite bookshops in the whole country, not just because of the amazing atmosphere that you guys have created, but also for the great audience who've, taken the time on this dreary Tuesday evening to come and listen to me talk about the intricate economic policies of empire. This is what you do for fun up here. Fair enough.
Well, yes, by introduction to the book, the book's sort of centrally concerned with the economic violence of British Empire, both in its establishment and in the post-colonial era. It unsettles our idea of empire as something distant or past. It builds on the work of many brilliant contemporary writers, but it fills a noticeable gap. I was blown away by the ambition and the clarity in it. So I'm going to ask a few questions, and then you'll have a chance to ask some questions. And anyone watching from home, hello, you can ask a question, as long as you're watching this on Tuesday. So you start the book by examining the British state. So I'll start there too. The book makes clear that what we recognise as our modern governance, the institutions from finance to parliament, are fundamentally products of empire. Can you talk us through how that is?
Yeah.
Nice, easy one.
I think that really is a great question and gets to the heart of what I was trying to do with this particular project. Like you mentioned, this is a project that is definitely in conversation with a lot of the excellent books that have really emerged around the topic of empire over the last few years, from Akala's Natives to Bria van der Gopal's Insurgent Empire. There's been a number of books that have really touched on the way in which empire still informs our cultural and symbolic and literary preconceptions. This is something that really, I think, exploded, particularly in the aftermath of the death of George Floyd. There's not an immediate connection between the death of an African-American man in Minneapolis and a kind of national reckoning with Britain's imperial legacy that emerged with the pulling down of the Edward Colston statue in Bristol. I think that the way in which conversations around race and racial violence seamlessly bled into a conversation around decolonisation in the United Kingdom showed that it was a conversation that people were ready to have. It had been suppressed for so long, and with the slightest provocation, it erupted. And so I was writing almost in response to that moment, but also in a kind of a little bit of a tension with the way in which the conversation around decolonisation then began to cohere, at least in the public discourse. After the pulling down of the Colston statue, we were talking about, the pulling down the Robert Mulligan statue and the changing of the name of, all these different spaces and locations, from Tulse Hill to, the Thomas Guy Hospital, that all these places were reckoning with their imperial legacy in terms of our road names, in terms of our cultural institutions, museums, in terms of our curriculums in universities and schools. And I thought that this was all vital, really potent work. I mean, no one wants to walk around with a giant slave trader having a giant statue next to them on their way to, buy some coffee in the morning. Like, it's just a bit much at 7 a.m. in the morning. But I did want to get back to what I thought was the kind of core motivation of empire, the reason why people got on ships and sailed halfway around the world to Lagos, Nigeria, or to India, or to Singapore. And it wasn't simply to build statues or to, give them a bit of Jane Austen and be like, have you ever thought about reading some Shakespeare? No, they went over there in order to extract and transfer wealth and resources all across the world. And so I wanted to get back to that element of empire, that material element of empire, and to think about, well, what is the legacy of that? What were the systems that were put in place to facilitate that global extraction of wealth? What were the legal systems? What were the financial institutions? What did it do to the concept of the British state, as you mentioned? I think we often think about this idea of, Britain had an empire. We would say that easily, Britain had an empire. This is the British Empire that Britain had. But if you look at it historically, it's more accurate to say that the empire had Britain, in terms of the imperial project is actually what brought together the unification of Scotland and England in the very first place. And we can see that when we look at, people like Robert Burns, who talks about the Scottish nobles of having sold out for English gold. The idea that in order to try and, first of all, recover from Scotland's own imperial project, which didn't manifest itself too successfully in New Caledonia, they were then seduced by the emerging English Empire. By the time we have the Act of the Union in the early 1800s, we've already had Britain enjoy colonial jurisdiction over Barbados and Jamaica and the slave colonies in Virginia for decades. And so England's already an imperial entity by the time we have the foundation of the Union, the United Kingdom. And this informs the way in which our parliament has manifested itself. This informs the way in which the common law has developed over the years. An American legal scholar, Katrina Pistor, talks about the English common law as being the code of capital, that this is the language, the mechanism through which global capitalism emerged. And I thought about just trying to get back to that legacy of empire and to connect it to the kind of material inequalities, the insecurity of work, precarious employment, the cost of living crisis, all the economic challenges that we're struggling with in not just the global south, but now increasingly in the global north in 2022. So that's really what I tried to do.
And that carries through the book, that sense that sort of picks up steam chapter by chapter of how much we are built by empire. All our recognizable institutions were in service to the money that was extracted from empire, and our legal spaces. I know in the book you make the case that to a certain degree that the culture wars are something of a distraction from those bigger questions, which will form most of my questions. But before I move on to those, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how Britain outsourced empire and how that shaped the way people on this island have a completely divorced understanding of being a part of that bigger history.
Absolutely. I think that this is where the kind of public memory and questions around our cultural connection to this imperial past synthesizes with the kind of legal and economic structure of empire. Because what was particularly distinctive about the British Empire, the reason they made it the code of capital, is that in comparison to, you know, the Spanish Empire or the French Empire, which were much more kind of state-centered enterprises. What the British Empire really mastered was in weaponizing private capital in order to facilitate its extension of imperial domination across the globe. And so this is the role of the private corporations, from the East India Company to the Royal Africa Company to the Royal Niger Company to the Hudson Bay Company in North America to the Anglo-Iranian Company, which is now BP. Maybe we can talk about that story a little bit later. You know, these companies did much of the dirty work of British imperialism. And I think that what that facilitated in terms of a cultural memory is it allowed the actual violence of empire to be seen as something that's not part of the British national story, not part of the state story. The national story is, you know, Henry VIII and the Gunpowder Plot and, you know, World War II, and that's the kind of domestic story. And what went on in India, well, that's just the East India Company. You know, who really cares about the private goings on of you know, of a multinational company? That's not part of the national story. What happened in Nigeria? That's just the Royal Niger Company creating the modern state of Nigeria. You know, no one really wants to spend their time looking through the account books of these old colonial companies, but through their partnership with the state, they managed to make the British Empire the largest empire in human history in terms of both landmass, population, and most importantly, wealth. And so I think that the outsourcing of empire wasn't just a practical thing, it also had the facility of kind of outsourcing it from our collective memories. And by trying to bring that back into the national story, I think we can understand so much more about the shape that our world takes in this current moment.
Yeah, I think that was something that struck me about the book that definitely made me understand or see more clearly how deliberate that broken connection between the lived reality of empire for most of the empire, and then why on earth it's not taught in schools or readily available or part of our public consciousness. In terms of raising that historical awareness, the decolonizing being more than toppling statues and sort of reclaiming that radical history. And you mentioned Priyam Gopal's amazing book as well. I wondered if you could explore a few of the sort of foundation blocks of empire that we ultimately will need to shatter to be able to move beyond. The first one, it's a nice easy one from the company chapter. The role that the English conception of property played in reinforcing the global corporate power that we see today.
Absolutely. I love talking about property on a Tuesday evening. But I think it is actually really important, particularly when we think about the placing of the ideas of the global strength of private property relations in kind of contradistinction to the value of sovereignty, which is a part of a big debate that has happened first in the global south, and now we're starting to see even in the global north. You know, outside of, you know, fears of migrants and there's a lot of brown people coming here, we also need to, I think, recognize that there was this underlying fear around the Brexit moment of a loss of sovereignty, a loss of control. We need to take back control. But it was redirected towards take back control from the EU or take back control from, you know, migrant people who might look different from you, rather than this idea that maybe my feeling of loss of control, if I'm from South Shields or Blackpool or Sunderland or Middlesbrough, is because of the way in which global capital is starting to erode the ability for people to democratically hold their governments to account by encasing private capital from the demands of sovereignty, borrowing a word from the political economist Quinn Slobodian, to try and take it back, to try and make that kind of contradistinction a little clearer. I think that we need to remember that with all these private companies extending their property and wealth all across the world, decolonization, like formal decolonization that happened in the mid-20th century, was a major problem to you. If you're a company that sources your gold in Ghana and, you know, manufactures it in Nigeria and then sells it in London and then places those profits in the Cayman Islands or the British Virgin Islands, Decolonisation is a problem because rather than operating under the umbrella of one single jurisdiction, now you've got all these different governments that you might have to account to. All of them that could provide different labour regulations, different tax demands, use sovereignty to hold private capital to account. And so that's a big problem if you're part of these companies. And that is a big part of the story of decolonisation that we forget. Decolonisation isn't simply a metaphor, it was a real significant political process in the middle of the 20th century where like 3/4 of the world changed from being colonial subjects into being sovereign territories. But I think what happened as a backlash to that was, in order to mitigate the power of global sovereignty, what we had was a reinforcement of private property rights. And so a taking out of control to be able to use your resources and wealth to be able to improve the lives of your people, and instead protecting the property rights of multinational corporations. I think I'll just share a little story to kind of make that comparison clear. And this is a story that I think is quite relevant today because this is the origin story of one of the companies that are most significant in our contemporary energy crisis. And so, along with a litany of other colonial companies, one of the significant English colonial companies to emerge at the turn of the 20th century was the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, originally known as the Anglo-Persian Oil Company. And they'd cultivated oil refineries in the Abadan region of Iran and were enjoying extravagant profits through this private-public partnership with the British state. Now, all going swimmingly until we start to get to the aftermath of the Second World War, and we start to get this wave of decolonisation starting to spread all across the world. And Iran, which had been part of Britain's informal empire like Argentina and Hong Kong and all these other places, elects a new president, Mohammad Mossadegh. Mohammad Mossadegh decides that he wants to use the resources of Iran for the betterment of the lives of the people of Iran. How absurd, ridiculous. Which is pretty much the response in the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company boardroom. This is absurd. And most sadly, I think, also within the British government. And the reason why I say most sadly is that the British government at the time was the Labour government of Clement Attlee, the government that is now canonised as the most progressive government within British political history. Built the NHS, built council houses, and perhaps most hypocritically, nationalised huge parts of the British state, from the failing industries in terms of trains and coal services. They used nationalisation to fund their own welfare state. But when faced with the prospect of the Iranian government doing the same thing, they said that is outrageous. We had the attempt to wage war upon Iran. People like Herbert Morris, who was the foreign secretary at the time, said that there needs to be some gumbo diplomacy to discipline these disobedient natives. Britain sought to get a UN Security Council against Iran. It also took Iran to the ICJ in order to get international law weaponized against this action after Mossadegh had seized the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company's property. Failed on all of these different elements, and so it resorted to a good old-fashioned coup d'etat in partnership with the United States, and this has all been declassified now. British security services encouraged a coup in Iran, which led to Mossadegh being placed under house arrest, where he would eventually die, and the new Iranian government was much more amenable to the interests of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company and a few other American oil companies that also came to get their share of the pie. After this kind of international scandal, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company thought, we might have suffered a bit of brand damage here, might be time to have a little bit of a name change. And so they then changed their name to British Petroleum, which eventually would become BP. And so what I try and do in the book is try and place the story of, well, what happened to BP and what happened to the people of Britain for having a government that supported BP against the interests of democratic sovereignty around the world. Has that benefited the people of Britain? When we think about the fact that BP is now one of the largest environmental polluters in the world, responsible for the world's largest environmental disaster from the Deepwater Horizon. It's constantly cited as one of the largest tax avoiding firms in the United Kingdom, often receiving a tax rebate every year from the British state, so they're paying them for avoiding to pay their tax. And particularly at this moment, when the energy crisis is leading to a really acute cost of living crisis, we have pensioners unable to heat their homes, having to ride around the buses just to stay warm. We're having people, looking over their monthly bills on a day-by-day basis, struggling how they're going to make payments. We have the British state once again protecting BP by refusing to impose a windfall tax on the exorbitant profits that they're enjoying, so much so that their CEO recently described the energy crisis as, I quote, turning his company into a cash machine. And so I try and retell that story in order to say, who should the people of Britain, not the state of Britain or the politicians, not the capitalists of Britain, but the people of Britain, who should they feel in solidarity with when reading the story of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company and the Mossadegh government? The people who would long to dismiss all conversation around empire would say, well, you should support BP, British company. Boris Johnson at the time of the Deepwater Horizon described any attacks on BP, for having poisoned half of the Gulf of Mexico. He described them, well, that's just anti-British. And it's like, well, they don't seem very patriotic when they're letting people freeze to death in their homes in order not to pay a little bit more in tax. And so I try to tell that story to explain how the protection of global property rights against the interest of democratic sovereignty was devastating to the decolonial countries, in the 1960s and 1970s and 1980s, but now it's also having an impact in the living standards of people right here in the global north.
Thank you for that. I think it does illustrate one of the things you do throughout the book is that blend of looking at sort of the hard stats and facts, and then these anecdotes and these human stories, or not human in the case of BP, but rather than move on to my next question, if I could ask you for another one of those stories, because one of the sort of repeated patterns in the book is this evidence that what we think of in sort of post-empire was this idea that Britain gave away gave them their freedom and then walked away, and then if they're not thriving today, it's really their fault because we just walked away, and even then they've had all this time and all this help. And what you show throughout the book is evidence of sort of quite active sabotage, often state-sponsored or stepping aside for corporations. There were these moments of hope in places like Jamaica or Ghana where there was a moment of trying to do something different. I wonder if you would pick maybe one of them to talk about that moment.
Sure. So what I try and do a lot throughout the book is, again, begin with these anecdotes of what actually happened during the decolonial era. Because of the amnesia of empire, we know so little about this globally transformative project of taking 3/4 of the world from being colonial subjects into being sovereign states. I think at the time of the last Commonwealth Games, there was a YouGov poll that showed that 1 in 5 Britons couldn't name a single Commonwealth country. Not India, not Jamaica, not even Australia. Australia, you'd imagine that this would be right there, but this is the level of amnesia we have around decolonisation. And so I try to retell the stories to try and explain why our world has taken the shape that it has, and particularly tie it to the rise of what is commonly referred to as neoliberalism. And so with that, I think, maybe the story of Michael Manley in Jamaica might be a really potent example of this, because in terms of a lot of the things that we struggle for now, things like democratic control over corporations, things like limitations on the environmental damage that these corporations can do, rights like the right to food, international legislation against the exacerbation of poverty. A lot of these were actually passed in a resolution that we've now forgotten about, called the New International Economic Order, the resolution for the new international economic order, which was led by this radical prime minister from Jamaica, Michael Manley. Anyone who's a Bob Marley fan will probably have seen there's a really close relationship between those two. So Bob Marley performed at this big concert that was supposed to be, well, Michael Manley kind of made it covertly, like his kind of political rally, and because of that, that's when Bob Marley gets shot and Rita Marley gets shot in the head, it's by the opponents of Michael Manley who think that his popularity is going to transfer over to Michael Manley and, you know, reinforce his presidency. So this is a really interesting figure of someone who, you know, was born to a kind of political dynasty, but really aligned himself with the people of Jamaica, with the Rastafarian movement, with, you know, the impoverished black masses of Jamaica, rather than with the kind of elite society that people might have expected him to be in alignment with. And so he becomes the Prime Minister of Jamaica, and not only, you know, imposes a national minimum wage, you know, about 20 years before it comes into the UK, not only imposes all of these investments in health and education and welfare, but he also tries to lead what at that time was called, in rather positive and proud terms, the Third World Movement. And so this is the alliance of countries from the Caribbean to Africa, to Latin America, to Southeast Asia, that saw themselves as presenting a third alternative to the current world system that was wrestled in that competition between capitalism and kind of Soviet communism. And so they took on this third worldist vision with real pride, and Manley became almost its spokesperson, particularly in the international institutions. And by bringing together this kind of insurgent movement that had been bubbling under with the Bandung Conference and the Tricontinental Conference, he eventually helps put together this resolution that is going to be passed at the UN for a new international economic order, which, like I said, has, you know, countries the right to control the actions of transnational corporations, guarantees the right to food for every person in the world. This seems to be an indication of a new moment in the economic relationships that shape all of our material lives on a day-to-day basis. But unfortunately, what happens with Manley, and what happens in so many of these cases, is that they are faced with a counter-revolution, a backlash. And that backlash with Manley was very much concentrated in the election of two people, one in the United Kingdom and one in the United States, Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. And they get elected right before the first and only ever so far North-South conference, which was supposed to rubber stamp the resolution for the new international economic order into being, which was held in Cancun. And in the book, I take a look through a lot of the kind of obstructionist actions that Thatcher particularly took and took pride in taking in the Cancun conference to ensure that that resolution would never be ratified and never become part of formal international law. She comes back and speaks in Parliament about how there appears to have been some delusion on behalf of the people of the Third World who assume that, you know, we will simply put all of our wealth into international. One of the provisions was the creation of a UN bank rather than forcing countries in the developing world to go to the IMF and the World Bank, where they would get loans with huge conditionality, you know, to open up their markets, to decimate their welfare state, to subject themselves to the whim of capital. They thought a creation of a UN bank, because control of the UN, unlike control of the Bretton Woods institutions, the IMF and the World Bank, is weighted towards the countries of the South by just sheer numbers. The General Assembly, one country, one vote, and so more countries are in the poor South than there are in the rich North, so they control that in a way that it's not tilted when it comes to the IMF and the World Bank. So they wanted to create a bank based in the UN, and Thatcher said, I'm not going to put British deposits into a bank that is run solely by people who live on their overdraft or live in debt. And so the weaponization of the language of debt, the weaponization of structural adjustment programs through the IMF and the World Bank opened up that third world movement and allowed it to fall in on itself. At the same time, the Manley's position in Jamaica was undermined by a political opponent, Edward Sager, who was nicknamed in Jamaica Edward C.I. Ager due to his close connections with the not only American political class, but also American security services. And so the failure of the Manley project, we can see in the structural adjustment programs that were not only imposed on Jamaica, but imposed on Ghana, were imposed in Kenya, were imposed in so many of these other former colonial territories of Britain, places that were part of Britain, when most of our parents, if were alive, grandparents, if not parents, were alive. This is all part of creating the world of neoliberalism that we now all wrestle with when we see lack of investment in our schools, lack of investment in our hospitals, the disintegration of the social security system in the United Kingdom, the lack of the welfare state in the United Kingdom. This is all a continuum of that new imposition of violent neoliberalism in the colonies. And I think the story of Michael Manley in Jamaica in the 1970s really tells that story well.
Thanks for that. I think it really illustrates the way you put those two things together. Picking up on debt, specifically, you have a chapter in the book called Debt, and in it, one of the things that becomes clear is sort of we have this idea in Britain that we're immune from whatever the state or these companies did trialed around the world through empire, but in fact those same mechanisms are now being used at home. And I think it would be nice to hear, maybe not nice, it's really horrible.
Nothing in this book is nice. If you want a nice book, this is not the book.
Rage-inducing. Would you all please make it very angry about the way, first of all, how debt was weaponized in that post-colonial context, and then how it's coming back to haunt us.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think the kind of post-2008 moment in which the language of austerity, the language of, we all need to tighten our belts, that we're all in it together, the way that language was used to justify real disintegration of the social safety net, the closing of Sure Start centres and libraries, the destruction of the benefit system. I was working actually as a social welfare lawyer really in the kind of post-2008 aftermath, and you're putting in personal independence payment applications and ESA applications and things that would have been sailed through with people with clearly recognizable mental and physical health issues were just being turned down, declined. The support that people relied upon to make it through their lives was pulled away from under them. That moment was justified through the language of debt, through the idea that, well, we've all, there's no more money left, as the Tories famously said when entering into office after Labour, the idea that we've all spent, we've all enjoyed the good times, and now we all need to suffer through the hard times. People are like, you might have been enjoying the good times, David Cameron, but my good times and your good times are not the same good times. But I think the way in which debt can function as an almost theological justification for violence. It's almost, it's beyond material. It's almost kind of seen as quasi-religious in terms of, that's why religion functions on the concept of the original sin. That you're born in debt and you were born at a negative, and therefore whatever happens to you is a justification for that lack that you were already born with. And this is very much what happened with the post-colonial countries. That actions that couldn't be justified on a political basis or a social basis or an economic basis were justified through the financial language of debt. That, we have to close down huge amounts of medical treatment because you found yourself in debt and frankly you can't afford it anymore. And the best type of debt, this is, any story about Mephistopheles or any story about, I've got a little 3-year-old, you reading her all these stories about, the wicked witches and all that kind of stuff. They recognize, I think she's watching Ursula in The Little Mermaid. I'm going to connect this to economic decolonization in a second. What? But the best type of debt is the debt that you can never pay, something that you owe that you can never clear, because that allows the person to have that constant dominance over you as an entity. And that's very much what happened with the structural adjustment programs, that they would impose these conditions on loans that were granted to already economically isolated developing countries, and then the rate of interest and the acceleration of debt would create a whirlwind that could never be put back in its cage. And with that, these countries were in a constant and almost permanent state of subjugation. So their ability to try and do the type of things that Kwame Nkrumah, the Mohamed Mossadegh, the Michael Manley tried to do in that 1950s to 1980s moment was gutted now through the language of debt and through the language of the protection of the property rights of transnational corporations across the world.
That's really grim. And then by the end, because it is so current, you pull that then into COVID and the sort of landscape around vaccines and all the rest of it. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to ask an uplifting question and then hand over to you for some questions, including you online. Looking to the future, you named your last chapter, There Is an Alternative. And so not to spoil the ending for everyone, how do you see us breaking this chain?
Yeah, I think I definitely am hopeful and ambitious, and I do think that the kind of neoliberal counter-revolution isn't inevitable, and if it was, they wouldn't work so hard at sustaining it. They want to say that this is just a natural way that the market would emerge. If you simply remove the hand of the state, well then why with cultural and financial pressures year on year, you working so hard to maintain that status quo. I think that the hope that I tried to facilitate through this book was to try and create space for there to be an alliance of a sort between the interests of the left behind, the kind of economically abandoned communities of the United Kingdom, and the devastated communities of the global south that were at the very front line of neoliberal global violence. I think I didn't really realize until the end of the book that, in the book I touch on a little bit of kind of personal memoir of growing up between Ghana, the first African state to have left the empire, so in the kind of trajectory of development that we're always told about, the one supposed to be furthest ahead. I talked about growing up between Ghana and the United Kingdom and seeing how, rather than the development that we're always told about, which is that all these countries in the global south are on their way to become like Britain, don't worry about the fact that there's no, state-run hospitals within Ghana. Soon, if you, eat your vegetables and say your prayers and do everything that the IMF tells you, eventually, in 20 years, you'll be able to have the kind of, NHS that you see here in the United Kingdom. But instead of seeing the complete opposite, I think that you've seen the kind of economic inequality, the precariety of employment, and the disintegration of the social safety net and the welfare state that was writ large through the global south, now starting to seep into places like the United Kingdom and the United States. And that kind of European social democratic model is falling apart with wealth inequality. And so what I tried to do with the book was tell that story, but I think it wasn't until the end of the book that I realized it was also kind of speaking to the place that, I was raised, which is in, in Merseyside, and my dad lived for a long time in South Shields, and so I know a lot of that, post-industrial north really, really well. And the kind of, I don't want to use the kind of popular media slogan, but the kind of fall of the red wall and the contrast that was opened up between, the interests of, the economically abandoned people, the left behind of the red wall, and the kind of metropolitan, multicultural people who care about race and identity. This is the way that the media was talking about politics in Britain at the moment, that either you care about, race and empire, or you care about the economically abandoned and the left behind. And what I tried to do with this book was show how, in fact, those things are intimately connected. That, if we move the conversation of empire away from culture and actually talk about the structures of empire, we can see how deindustrialization, we can see how the failure of the British state to collect tax revenues, we can see how offshoring, we can see how all of these different elements facilitate the devastation that is wrought through everywhere, like I mentioned, from, Hull to Burnley to Middlesbrough to Sunderland. And so by telling that story, you know, I hope that there's space for those new alliances, which for me is what those in power are really worried about, you know. And I think it's been interesting as conversations have shifted onto other legacies of empire, like you know, the tax stuff with that, you know, the role the British overseas territories have played in encasing wealth from, you know, every oligarch in the world, or the non-dom rule, which is another imperial hangover, played in the kind of, you know, enrichment of the Sunak family. And when those conversations are had, it's a lot less comfortable for the culture warriors of the right to talk about empire. They would love to talk about should we or should we not sing Rule Britannia or Land of Hope and Glory. They'll do that debate all day. But if you talk about, well, should we intervene in the Cayman Islands to stop it acting as an offshore tax haven for all these private capitalists, they don't really want to have those conversations. And so by bringing those conversations into the public discourse a little bit further, there was a hope that it might create those new alliances between the interests of, the left behind the United Kingdom and the interests of those people who've been devastated by the backlash to decolonisation all the way in the global south.
It is hopeful, right? I think it's very telling.
We'll see if it works. I didn't say it was going to work.
But it's a start. And I think at the moment it feels like we're all looking for those starting blocks. Like, how do you chip away when it's that? And I think I found it very telling that even the centre-right media hasn't engaged with your book and hasn't engaged with these themes because they can't on that level. And to a certain degree, we keep sacrificing the ground for discourse to whatever they want to talk about. And being able to be in a position to say, actually, we have a lot of material that we should be holding them account, that lots of people with lots of different interests can be holding them account, that we can use that. So it's a useful book for that. You can throw it at people or use the ideas. Your turn for questions. Do we have any burning questions in the room? There's one at the back. I will let you say it and then I will repeat it for anyone who's watching online.
I don't know how easy that would be. It's a bit of a complicated question.
Sure.
But no, I found your chapter on Singapore very interesting, especially in the context of that model being heralded by the Brexiteers as UK needs to transform now into the land of opportunity almost.
Yeah.
And I just wonder, do you have any confidence in sort of UK institutions? Because obviously the UK state is bigger than the Conservative Party in
Of course,
power, and there are some good examples of good institutions in the UK. Do you think that institutional framework is at all capable of resisting a switch to that model of sort of the lowest of the low regulatory environments to create the Singapore on Thames sort of Jacob Rees-Mogg seems to have?
That was indeed a very eloquent question for me to have to condense. But do you want to just frame your answer in a way that sets the question? So it's about the chapter on Singapore and UK institutions.
No, absolutely. So the chapter that that burning question is gesturing towards is one that kind of looks at the emergence of what one of the most significant figures of kind of Singapore independence, Ragnar Ratnam, described as the birth of the global city. And the global city is these kind of nubs of capital that are more interconnected with each other than they are with the kind of rural areas of their own kind of nation states. We always think about the world as a map of nation states, but anyone who might have moved from New York to London to Dubai to Mumbai to Johannesburg to Singapore, you can start to see the resonances and the architecture and the role that private capital plays within all of these territories. And with both the emergence of the global city, I think has come in this current moment of British politics, a particular romanticization of the history of Singapore as in that narrative anyway. I think this is much more complicated when we look at the substance of what happened in Singapore, but in that narrative as the one colonial child that listened to our lessons and opened itself up to free market, didn't experiment with trying to set up state-run industries, allowed finance capital to run free and has been subsequently rewarded. If only you could do the same, Nigeria and all these other places, Botswana and stuff. But I think that is a imaginary of what Singapore is, that Daniel Hannan and Jacob Rees-Mogg and Peter Hargreaves, not just politicians, major financial billionaires, institutions, James Dyson, promotes this idea of Singapore on Thames model. A lot of the financiers who drove the Brexit movement had this idea as well, this is going to be what Britain's going to look like afterwards. Out of the EU, we can cut through all regulation. We don't need, even, things like maternity leave, and we don't need things like, unemployment payment. This is, we could get rid of all of that and allow, the spirit of competition to once again triumph in Britain as they did in Singapore. I think that this is just a justification for what they want to do, which is create the perfect conditions for maximum profiteering, for maximum extraction of the labour power and resources of the United Kingdom, and the ability to encase as much of that wealth as possibly within their own hands. I don't think this is an actual admiration for the story of Ratnam and Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore, which obviously uses a huge amount of state power in terms of, control of the housing market, in terms of, can be used that state power in also quite disciplinary ways in terms of, kind of criminal disciplining regulation, but also it's very interventionist in the market. It's not simply let the market run free like some sort of Wild West. And so I think that particular wing of the Brexit movement was, I think, hampered by the pandemic, the COVID stuff. It's one of the very few good things about the pandemic, but I think that it did make clear the requirement for mass state mobilization, even though Britain did a particularly poor job of it, outsourcing its track and trace to Serco and, being really slow in terms of the distribution of PPE contracts because the government had decided that, all their friends they went to boarding school with should be the best people to distribute PPE, even though they've never done it a day in their lives. And so Britain was a lot slower at it, but, with the cultivation of the vaccine program and with just the general control of population through lockdown, it was clear that there is a necessary role for a strong, mobilized state. And so I think they've been a little bit quieter over the last couple of years, but, I don't believe that if given the right historical moment, they wouldn't again try to present that narrative of, well, this is how Britain can deal with its economic stagnation. This is how we can deal with the fall of cost of living crisis. We simply cut everything, we open ourselves up to the financial market, and we simply allow the kind of chaos of capitalism to reign free.
Anyone else have a question to follow on from that? Well, I'll ask one while you have your thinking caps. I can see you ponder, and then I'll check who's asking online. Sort of connected to that, the whole the double standards with which Britain went around saying you couldn't possibly have religion in your state mechanisms, and yet we have the Queen as the head of the church. And over and over again, there's this hypocrisy of what we will allow or we do here that makes that we won't allow anyone else to figure out their own way of doing it. Can you talk about some of those hypocrisies?
Yeah. Well, I think a lot of those hypocrisies are really explained by the fact that we need to recognize that, like I said at the start, that Britain isn't a nation state in terms of its formation. It is still structured as an imperial project. It came together as an imperial project, and it hasn't gone through. So people like, Tom Nairn and Perry Anderson, I think, have been really excellent in describing how Britain hasn't gone through the kind of even standard bourgeois European nation state formation that would require things like the separation between the legislature and judiciary, which only happened very recently. Before then, the House of Lords, which was both the upper house of the legislature, was also the final court of the judiciary. Like, you know, the fact that, you know, we still have unelected clerics within within the legislature, and that we still have a representative of the City of London that sits within Parliament called as the Remembrancer. You know, this is an unelected champion of private capital that sits in our supposedly home of democratic mother of parliaments. You know, all of these standards wouldn't be acceptable this is, I think, one of the interesting things when people talked about the Brexit debate, is that if Britain did want to decide to apply back to the European Union, and it went through the same kind of state checks and standards of democratic institutions that it imposes upon countries of Eastern Europe when they want to join, it wouldn't pass. It doesn't have those necessary separation between powers, that necessary function of democratic control in order to be a kind of standard social democratic European nation state, which I'm not saying is perfect by any means, but I think that does also help us explain when we remember that Britain isn't that it isn't a nation state, it is this kind of zombie hangover of an empire in its constitutional formation as well as in its economic formation. We can understand things like why the City of London is this kind of quasi-autonomous zone, you know, the square mile of London, not the full City of London, that, you know, from like, you know, Sydenham to Tottenham. No, we're talking about the square mile where anyone who's been there knows you've got the different police officers, you've got the different bollards, you've got this weird quasi-autonomous district that simply functions as the coordinator of global capital all around the world, you know, taking money from Hong Kong and sending it over to the British Virgin Islands. It's kind of outside of the democratic control of the British state, and that's because we need to recognise again that what we consider to be Britain was constituted and remains being constituted to a large extent by its imperial project.
Do you have a question?
Yeah, I've got a follow-up question.
Yeah, go for it.
I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about the monarchy in relation to, because I think about it in terms of the beginning of the global stamping of, like, you know, of the kind of like FTSE 100 model of the company, like the stock, the shareholding company, which as the East India Company kind of being the first of those, and just in that relationship between the monarchy and this kind of facilitation of like 400 years of global extraction, and maybe how we might think about that in this context as well.
Yeah, well, thank you. Brilliant question. And it's one that I've tended to actually speak a little bit about because, you know, the kind of run of having the book out was also coordinated with, you know, the monarchy embarrassing themselves on a global stage, like, you know, Kate and Will's deciding to go and shake the hands of kids behind the cages in Jamaica and then being like, oh, why don't these people, they want to get rid of us, it seems so strange. And that's kind of provoked this conversation about the role that the monarchy plays within empire, not just symbolically, which is the way that it's often discussed, or what is a symbol of empire, you know, but it's not simply a symbol of empire, it is jurisdictionally a function of that imperial control. That is why the Queen is the head of state of Jamaica and of Cayman Islands, the British Virgin Islands, and not just the Queen, the Privy Council, one of the most shadowy bodies within Britain's supposedly democratic structure. You know, this is a body made up of essentially advisors to the Queen, and that allows the power of the Crown to continue to be weaponized through things like prorogation of Parliament and through the use of royal prerogative powers. The Privy Council is also the highest court in the land for all of these, you know, Commonwealth and, you know, potentially, you know, overseas territories. Even independent countries like Jamaica still have, you know, if you go to court and, you know, you go to the appeal court, you go to the appeal court after that, eventually the final authority you receive will be the Queen's advisors. Like, so this is the kind of way in which the monarchy functions as this continuing mechanism of British imperial rule. And it's because it emerged, like you mentioned, in co-collaboration with those private companies, you know, all the way from the Levan and the Muscovy Company, you know, under Queen Mary, never mind Queen Elizabeth, we had the first emergence of those colonial companies, to, you know, the biggest of them all, the East India Company in the 1600s, all the way to the Anglo-Iranian Company that emerges at the turn of the 20th century. These companies, I think we need to remember, the corporation wasn't what we thought it is now, where anyone can just go on company house, pay a few, bit of money, and then you and your friends can declare yourself shareholders and have a company. Back then, the corporation could only come into existence through a royal charter. So you'd have to apply for a royal charter, and the state would grant you that monopoly over the slave trade of the west coast of Africa that it would grant to the Royal African Company, who was also, the director was also related to the king at the time. And so this kind of close proximity between these colonial companies, between the Hudson Bay Company and the Crown, in order for the Crown to outsource its control over North America, helps explain so much of how those companies functioned and why they did so much of the kind of philanthropic stuff around the state. When people say, oh, well, people shouldn't be hard on Edward Colston, he built a nice hall in Bristol, he built, he did all this kind of stuff. Like, this was to kind of wash away the stain of, slave blood money, but it was also part of the kind of public demands that the Crown placed on these companies in order to grant them their royal charter in the first place, in order to let them have that monopoly over wealth production in a particular territory, as was granted to all these different companies. So the Crown itself is a corporation. I think we need to remember itself. It is a corporation. It partnered with these other corporations to extend British colonial rule, and in the role that it plays within the world now, both constitutionally and jurisdictionally, it continues to function to extend control of the British state into the Caribbean and beyond.
I think I said to you last night, one of the things about the book is kind of like seeing how the sausage is made for the state, and then once you know the component parts, you're like, you're making us eat this, and we are just accepting that somehow, and then you look at what its constituent parts are, and it's wild. Yeah. It's complete madness.
I do think, just one thing I was going to say on a more positive note, I do think that there does seem to be an emergence of a kind of confrontation with the role that the actual monarchy plays, both within the United Kingdom and abroad. I think that because we personalise the monarchy, in the Queen, and oh, she's so sweet, and isn't she just like your grandmother, that it's minimised the way in which this isn't simply a kind of nice symbolic thing for tourists. This is a mechanism of governance. Mm-hmm. When Boris Johnson decided that he wanted to prorogue Parliament in order to try and drive through his Brexit deal, he did that through the prerogative powers of the Crown. That, the role that the Privy Council plays continues to be weaponized in order to be able to drive through particular policies, such as the expulsion of the people of the Chagos Islands, which they're still trying to get justice for up until this day. I think that we need to remember that the Crown hasn't just been left there by accident because it's been forgotten about. It's a key part of the kind of anti-democratic nucleus of the British state, which was always anti-democratic because empire is by definition an anti-democratic process. It is about the interests of the few over the interests of the many.
I've got one question from online, sure. Just to close it up. Someone has asked, do you think that the extreme wealth discrepancies within the UK are preventing the British people from recognising the ongoing effects of empire? And do you think that entrenching those inequalities is a tool that the state uses for this?
I mean, that's really interesting. I think that it is, but only in the way that our wealth inequality is narrativized, and that's what I was trying to do in this book, was to explain how that wealth inequality, the UK is a uniquely unequal society in terms of the kind of developed Western states, in comparison to the standard European nation states. The discrepancy between the richest parts of the United Kingdom and the poorest is much greater and has been growing. According to Credit Suisse, between 2000 and 2014, the United Kingdom was the only developed Western country that actually increased its levels of inequality, not just of income inequality, but more substantially, wealth inequality. And so what I try and do in this book is connect the drivers of those inequality, the entrenchment of asset prices, the protection of property, the inability to be able to hold corporations to account and demand state, tax revenue from them, the informality and precariety of employment, the weakening of labor rights, the lack of investment in welfare states and in health practices, all of these different drivers of inequality, I try to connect back to what happened in the aftermath of decolonisation and the imposition of inequality on the countries of the global south. I take an example of something like, well, what happened in the Caribbean that allowed the 3 largest corporate tax havens in the world, according to the Tax Justice Network, to still be British overseas territories: the Cayman Islands, the British Virgin Islands, and Bermuda. So these aren't independent countries, these are still territories that ultimate sovereignty rests with Westminster. And in the aftermath of decolonisation, when Michael Manley is trying to create this kind of West Indian social welfare model, we have the United Kingdom transforming the Cayman Islands into this offshore financial centre, as the kind of metaphor is described as, this tax haven, this place in which, through secrecy protections, you can store your wealth if you're somebody fortunate enough to be a wealthy capitalist, and you don't have to face the demands of sovereign nation states. You don't have to face their tax and their regulation demands. You can be a beneficiary owner of a company and nobody will know who you are. And this is why, for instance, London has now become a playground for the world's oligarchs and the most wealthy criminals in the world. They didn't come to London because they love Charles Dickens and want to watch Arsenal every week. That's not why all these Russian oligarchs came to London. They came to London because the legacy of Britain's imperial structures facilitate huge amounts of protection and hiding of wealth. And so that's why they were in London. And what's been the consequences for the people of London, for the people who have to work in London, the nurses, the teachers, the bus drivers, people who make the city function? Well, the consequences are you can't afford to buy a house no matter how hard you work. The escalation between asset prices and the price of wage has gone exponentially to a point in which nobody can sustain that. This has been a benefit of the people of the United Kingdom. The fact that because the UK refuses to hold these companies to account, we're not able to accrue the kind of tax revenue in order to invest in schools and hospitals and all those institutions that make people's lives livable. This is the inequality that people are struggling with, and I think by connecting that to the way in which Britain was structured, both through empire and has been protected in the aftermath of empire, I hope can allow those conversations to be had across, these different kind of political and intellectual traditions. So I think at the moment, wealth inequality is used to distract from empire, to say you don't have time, if you're struggling with your bills, to care about statues and songs and Edward Colston. You're struggling with trying to pay your bill now. You're trying to pay your energy bill now. And what I try and do in the book is say, yeah, well, the reason you're struggling to pay that energy bill is actually connected to the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, or connected to the Cayman Islands, or connected to all these other financial legacies of empire. So yeah, hopefully it's got some jokes in it as well. It's not, I think it's got some stuff. But thank you all for listening. Thank you for the questions, everyone at home.
And we have just touched on a fraction of what the book covers, and just the scope of it is astonishing. But then you weave it all together, and yes, there are jokes and stories, and it's deeply human, but it's an incredible feat. So congratulations on the book, and thank you for coming. Do you use your vouchers that you had as a ticket to take a copy home, and to give to your ignorant uncle or aunt that really needs this, because this book will change it's really hard to argue with. Now it's just time to put our hands together and say a very big thank you. We're going to very unelegantly extract ourselves from the window, and then Kojo, you're happy to sign around the corner. Absolutely. So if you've got a book, come on and bring it up.
I'd love to.
Can we get out?
Yeah, no.
Will we ever